Hi and welcome to my show. My name is Shanley. I'm a professional engineer. I specialize in renewable energy. And today I would actually like to talk about the energy situation in Europe. As I'm sure you're well aware, there's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and as a result, the gas supplies to Europe have been cut off. And this has caused the Europeans to have to start up some of their coal-fired power stations. And many people around the world are calling the Europeans hypocrites for promoting renewables all over the world, and yet they themselves have now started up some of their coal-fired power stations that have been sitting dormant for some time. And it's also made people ask the question, do renewables really work or don't they work? Are the Europeans hypocrites for starting up their coal-fired power stations? Does renewables work? What's the situation over here? So let's talk about that. I want to talk about that this evening. So the first thing we need to look at is the electricity demand. So every country, every region, every place has a demand curve. This is the amount of energy that is used, or rather the power, instantaneous power that's used at any moment, at any time. Okay, and it's a curve over time, goes up, goes down based on the amount of power required by the area that we're measuring this power requirement or doing this demand curve on. And this demand curve is partially predictable and partially unpredictable. It's partially predictable because there's a certain demand, a certain amount of power or certain level of power that's constantly required by a particular country, or let's call it the energy system. There's a certain minimum amount of a minimum power capacity that's required by the energy system, a minimum demand. And this is pretty much predictable, except for very rare or ad hoc situations. For example, Earth Day. On Earth Day, the system operators know that the demand is going to be very low, and so they actually switch off or ramp down some power stations to make sure that they're not overproducing. But for the most part, at least, there is this minimum demand that's required by the country, and this part is pretty much predictable. Then above that, the demand curve can pretty much do anything. It's very, very unpredictable. Well, to some extent, even though it's unpredictable, it is slightly predictable. For example, there's a morning peak where everybody kind of wakes up, switches on their stoves and switches on their kettles and so on. Then there's an evening peak as well. Everybody comes home, maybe starts cooking. Geysers go on, things like that. Okay, so there's a morning curve and an evening curve. It's above the minimum demand, and it's slightly unpredictable because it can go up and down, but it's somewhat predictable because we know what's happening in the morning, we know what's happening in the evening. And then above that, the really unpredictable parts are the slight or the instantaneous peaks here and there throughout the day. And the way that the energy system works is that we have system operators that are constantly matching the supply with the demand. They need to make sure that the amount of energy or the amount of electricity capacity that's available on the grid matches with the demand. Okay? And the way this is done is generally it's done by using three different types of power. There's what we call baseload power, and baseload power is what meets that predictable minimum amount of power throughout the day. These are power stations that generally don't do well with switching on and off, coal-fired power stations, nuclear power stations. They stay at a certain level and they stay that way, generally, okay? Unless there's like a breakdown, then they go down and we have to kind of meet that demand somewhere else. But that's baseload power, meeting that minimum demand. Then there's what we call mid-merit. Mid-merit is now we're meeting the predictable ups and downs throughout the day, or the somewhat predictable parts, somewhat predictable demand throughout the day. This is meeting that morning peak, meeting that evening peak, meeting any differences between any somewhat predictable differences between the minimum requirement or baseload power and where the demand is at that moment. The third kind of power that we have is what we call peaking. And now peaking is for meeting instantaneous mismatches between the supply and the demand. And each of these different power generation types also have different price points. Baseload power being the cheapest, mid-merit somewhere in between, and then the third one, peaking, most expensive. And they're also used in those levels as well. Baseload power, used most of the time. Mid-merit power, less time. And then peaking power, it's really only supposed to be for instantaneous spurts, instantaneous mismatches between supply and demand. So the problem that most people have with renewables, or generally the problem that we have with renewables, is that you can't really have or it's said that there's no baseload power with renewables. And why is that? Well, renewables, especially when we have the resources of wind and solar, are quite variable, very variable. Okay, the wind blows sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. It peaks, it increases speed and it slows down in speed. Same thing with the sun. The sun shines at different intensities throughout the day, different intensities throughout the year, and then also depending on where you are on the planet Earth, you can also have different intensities. And then of course there's no sunlight at nighttime. So renewables, especially wind and solar, are variable types of power. So there's no baseload power. So why would a country want to go renewables? Well, of course there's the environmental benefits. Okay, by using renewables, we're not pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay, it's cleaner production, and it's also resources that are going to be here for definitely longer than probably humans will be on this planet. Okay, the sun will continue to shine for the foreseeable future, for the next billion years or whatever. And because the sun will continue to shine, the wind will also probably continue to blow. Okay, it's renewables. It's not going to get finished. Fossil fuels, eventually there'll come a point where we've drilled all the oil, all the oil wells. We've cleared out all the coal mines. It's a finite resource that comes to an end, and renewables, at least for the foreseeable future, we know it's not going to be depleted. Okay, so why would somebody want to go renewables? Aside from the environmental component, there's also the cost component. In 2016, in South Africa, here at the CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, the CSIR did a study that demonstrated that South Africa could save 90 billion rand per year by building more solar and wind farms rather than building more nuclear and coal-fired power stations. 90 billion rand a year. And that's looking at a energy mix where you have 70% renewables or 70% wind and solar over the next, say, 30 years. You kind of ramp up to that 70%. And this saves the country 90 billion rand a year. So aside from the environmental component, there's also the cost component. Renewables are much cheaper. So if we do go renewables, what would a system that is highly based on renewables, what would that look like? Well, first thing is, in order for us to do that, in order for us to get to the point where we have high penetration of renewables, we need to change our way of thinking. We can't just think like we have in the past. We can't just think about, or we can't just have the mindset of having baseload, mid-merit, and peaking power. Our mindset has to change a bit. And although renewables are variable, although they are a variable source of energy, they've become very predictable. Increases or developments in our monitoring technology has made predicting what the sun's going to do and predicting what the wind is going to do. It's made it very easy and very accurate. And also, if we spread our solar farms and our wind farms throughout the country, there may be times where the wind is blowing on the East Coast and it's not blowing on the West Coast, or it's blowing on the West Coast and it's not blowing on the East Coast. And think about that scenario spread throughout the country. When we do that, and we have solar farms throughout the country where there may be cloud cover in one place, but the sun is shining in another place, balancing those things out. If we do that, we can mostly have a stable supply, and we can get to the point where we have 70%, even more than 70% of wind and solar. That our energy mix can be consisting of more than 70% of wind and solar. So spread throughout the country, with the increase in accuracy of monitoring that we can have a stable supply of energy, a stable supply of generation coming from wind and solar. But I say mostly because even if we do that, even if we spread our generation capacity in renewables throughout the country, there may still be instances, or there definitely will still be instances, where our supply from renewables don't meet our demand. There may be some of these mismatches. And in order to cater for these mismatches, we need something else called flexible generation. So we have renewables, which are variable. They ramp up and ramp down depending on what the weather is doing. And then we need flexible generation. This is generation that can ramp up very quickly and respond to these mismatches between the supply and the demand. So when you have variable renewables and you combine that with flexible generation, you have a stable supply as well. Now, flexible generation tends to be very much more expensive than renewables. It's even much more expensive than coal and nuclear. But because you're only using it for these short spurts of mismatches between what renewables can supply and the demand, overall, the energy system, if it's comprised of renewables plus flexible generation, overall, it's still much cheaper than building coal and more nuclear. So what are the different forms of flexible generation? Okay, they are actually even renewable forms of flexible generation. There's concentrating solar power. This is where you concentrate the sun's light, using mirrors, concentrate the sun's light to a central area. It could be a line focus, it could be a point focus. And the heat that's generated from this concentrating of the sun's energy, this can be used to we in a central receiver system, for example, you melt salt, and this heat can be stored for many days even. But the point is that storage of heat can be used to generate power at times where there's a mismatch between what renewables is supplying and what the demand is. So a renewable form of flexible generation is concentrating solar power, also biogas, so gas generated from organic matter or plant matter. Another form of flexible generation is storage. So these are batteries, these are hydrogen. It's pump storage. Pump storage, of course, is where we pump water up to a higher dam, from a lower dam to a higher dam in times where we have high generation. We have a lot of power on the grid, but the demand doesn't match. So you have more supply than you have demand. You can actually use that excess power to pump water from a lower dam up to a higher dam. And then during the times where you need these short spurts to match the supply and the demand, where the demand is higher than the supply, you can let that water back from the higher dam to the lower dam, and that helps you to match the supply and demand as well. So the second form of flexible generation is storage, batteries, hydrogen, and pump storage. And then there's also non-renewable forms of flexible generation. Most popular of these, of course, is gas turbines that are powered by natural gas. And the cheapest of all these flexible generation technologies is, of course, gas. And this, of course, makes gas the more favored option when it comes to combining renewables or complementing renewables with a flexible generation technology. Okay, so in South Africa, sun and the wind are quite predictable. We have a lot of sun, we have a lot of wind. And because of our monitoring technology, we can predict what the sun's going to do tomorrow. We can know what the wind is going to do tomorrow with enough certainty for us to be able to base our power system on those technologies. What's unpredictable is a supply of flexible generation in the form of gas. There may be some supplies of natural gas locally, but we may also need to import gas. And so while gas may be the cheapest form of flexible generation, it's not necessarily the most reliable form of flexible generation. And this is the situation in Europe. What happened was the reliability of gas was dependent on peace between Russia and essentially the rest of the world. And since that peace has been kind of broken up, there's this war happening. Now the supply of gas is gone. And as a result, that flexible generation is compromised, and now the renewables don't work out. So the problem isn't wind and solar. The problem is the reliability of flexible generation. And since there's so many different options of flexible generation, especially renewable forms of flexible generation included, it requires us to think a little bit differently about how we go about choosing flexible generation. So the idea here is that we shouldn't necessarily just choose the least cost flexible generation. We should also look at an energy mix where our flexible generation is also reliable and not necessarily just least cost. So not just least cost, but also least risky. So the lesson that we can take from the situation or the energy situation in Europe is not that renewables don't work. Renewables do work when we have the right mindset, when we combine the variable renewables with flexible generation. But what we can learn is that we need to be very strategic in our choice of flexible generation. We can't just choose the least cost. We can perhaps procure concentrating solar power. We can look at storage technologies. We can look at biogas. These things might not be the least cost in terms of flexible generation, but with a mix like that, we at least have less risk of falling into the same situation that's happening in Europe. So it may be a little bit more expensive than renewables plus gas, maybe a little bit more expensive, but overall, because you use flexible generation only in short spurts, overall it still would end up being more cheaper than building more coal and more nuclear. So maybe that 90 billion rand that we save every year, maybe it's not 90 billion every year. Maybe it's 80 billion. Maybe it's 50 billion. But still, it will be cheaper than building more coal and more nuclear. So this is the takeaway from what's happening in Europe. I'd like to know what your thoughts are. Tell me what you think. Anything that you disagree with, I really like to know. Put them in the comments below. And I'll see you next time.